My vacant land was sold by the HOA while I was deployed. But what happened next will shock you. My land was sold while I was halfway across the world, deployed, doing my duty, thinking everything was fine. But the HOA? They had other plans. Without telling me. Without warning. I thought it was a mistake. Until I saw the papers, signed and stamped. I had been away for a month. But my property? Gone. But what happened next? You won't believe it. Welcome to HOA Unit. I'm Mark, your guide through today's wild ride. I'm living in city state, just a regular guy. Or at least I thought so. Until the HOA decided to pull a stunt like this. So grab a seat, because this is going to be one crazy story. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had been deployed for just a month, thinking everything was fine back home. My wife, the house, the land I had bought years ago, all of it was supposed to be safe. But when I checked the mail that day, I found a letter, one that would change everything. The HOA. They were the last people I ever thought would do something like this. It wasn't like I was ever a troublemaker with them. I followed their ridiculous rules about lawn height, mailbox color, and even making sure my dog didn't make a sound after 8 p.m. But the one thing I thought was mine, my land, was now gone. I opened the envelope slowly, my hands shaking. It felt like a bad dream. I thought, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they were just sending a regular notice, the kind where they tell you that your lawn's a bit too high or your car's parked in the wrong spot. But no, this wasn't a regular letter. The first sentence read, "Notice of sale. Your property, vacant land at address, has been sold to a new owner." I stared at the words for a long time, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. I had left my property in good hands, in the hands of the HOA, who had always promised to protect and preserve our community. But now they were selling my land while I was overseas. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. No, this was something bigger. I reached for my phone, hands trembling as I tried to dial the HOA president's number. Janet. That was her name. She had always struck me as, well, not exactly friendly, but she was always there at the neighborhood meetings, giving her little speeches about rules and regulations. I couldn't recall a time when I had actually agreed with her, but I never thought she would do something like this. "Hello, this is Janet," the voice on the other end of the line said. I could hear the fake cheeriness in her tone, the kind that's meant to make you feel like everything is okay when you know, deep down, it's not. I forced myself to speak calmly. "Janet, what the hell is going on? Why did the HOA sell my land? I'm deployed. I didn't authorize this." There was a long pause. Too long. "Well," Janet started, her voice more measured now, "your property was marked as vacant. It had been unused for quite some time. You weren't maintaining it, and after a few months of non-response, the board decided to put it up for sale. It's all perfectly legal." I was dumbfounded. How could they possibly think I had abandoned my land? I had always kept up with the dues, kept in contact with my neighbors, made sure everything was in order. This wasn't just about some petty rule violation. This was a betrayal. "Let me speak with the rest of the board," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Of course, we'll send you the official documentation. It's all in the best interest of the community," she replied. But I could hear the indifference in her voice. This wasn't about the community. This was about money, power, control. I slammed the phone down and stared at the letter in my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rush back home and tear down the HOA's office. But I couldn't. I was stuck overseas, 1,000 miles away from my land and from the people who were supposed to help protect it. So what did I do? I started digging. I needed answers. The first thing I did was email the board members. But, as you can guess, no one responded. I wasn't surprised. They were good at avoiding questions, at making sure they could do whatever they wanted without anyone pushing back. I decided to call up a few neighbors who might have been around when the sale happened. Maybe they knew something, anything that could explain why my property was being sold like it was just another piece of junk. But the neighbors didn't know anything, or at least, they claimed they didn't. They didn't want to get involved. It was clear the HOA had their claws deeply embedded in this community. I felt like I was losing control, like there was no way to fix this. But I couldn't just let them take my land without a fight. That's when it hit me. I had to fight back. But how? What could I possibly do from thousands of miles away? I had no power here, no influence, no way to even talk to anyone who could help, and yet the anger inside me refused to go away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just let this slide. Then I remembered something. A small connection I had made back when I first moved into the neighborhood. A military contact. Someone who might be able to help me in ways I hadn't even thought of. I couldn't let the HOA get away with this. They had taken something that was mine, something I had worked hard for. And now they were going to pay. But that's when I started asking myself, how far would I go to get my land back? Would the HOA regret messing with me, or had I just signed up for a war I couldn't win? The sun had barely set when I received the final B. Lo, another letter from the HOA. I had hoped it would be some sort of apology, a mix-up, anything to make this nightmare go away. But instead, it was an official notice. Legal action has been initiated due to the unauthorized sale of your property. The audacity! They were going to sue me for challenging them? For trying to protect my land? I felt a rage build up inside me, something that almost felt like a fire burning through my chest. How could they do this? And why? What kind of people sell another person's land like it was a piece of furniture at a yard sale? My mind was running wild. I had followed every rule the HOA laid out, made sure my payments were on time, did everything they asked, and yet, this was how they treated me. I wasn't just some random homeowner in a boring suburban neighborhood anymore. I was an enemy now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I couldn't just storm into their office and demand answers. No, I was stuck in another country, over 7,000 miles away from the very place I called home. A place that, until now, had felt like my sanctuary. Now it felt like a battlefield. I had to figure this out on my own. I couldn't trust the HOA board to act with any sense of justice or fairness. They had shown me their true colors, and they didn't care about anything but their own control, so I took a deep breath and did what I knew best. I started digging. I would learn everything there was to know about this board, this president, and every decision they had made. I went back to the documents I had from when I first bought the land. The original contract, the HOA's rules and bylaws, everything. And as I looked through them, I found something interesting. Something I hadn't noticed before. There was a clause, a tiny little line buried deep in the paperwork. It wasn't even in bold or italics or highlighted like all the important stuff. But there it was. It stated that, in the event of property abandonment or lack of maintenance for a period exceeding 6 months, the HOA reserves the right to sell said property to prevent community decay. I could hardly believe my eyes. I hadn't abandoned anything. My land was just sitting there, waiting for the right moment. But I had never once been notified by the HOA that they were planning on selling it, nor had I ever received any letter telling me my land was being neglected. No warning, no notice, nothing. I scrolled through the rest of the documents, and sure enough, there it was again. A mention of vacant land and sale tucked neatly between other clauses about lawn care and neighborhood aesthetics. It made me sick to my stomach. So what did that mean? Did the HOA have the right to sell my property because I wasn't there to take care of it? I had been deployed. This was an emergency situation. I couldn't be in two places at once. But now, the HOA had turned my absence into an excuse to strip me of my land. The worst part? I hadn't even been given a chance to defend myself. I took a step back, sat down on the couch, and stared at the walls. I needed a plan. But first, I needed answers. The problem was that the HOA was a tight-knit group. Janet, the president, had been running the show for years. People feared her. They didn't question her. And why would they? She played the game so well. Too well. But something about her rubbed me the wrong way. She wasn't just the president of some little community organization. No. She was a power-hungry control freak who made it her mission to dictate every little detail about the neighborhood. She loved the power. She thrived on it. I dug deeper into the HOA's board members. They were all people who had been around for a long time, and most of them had some sort of position of power outside the HOA as well. That wasn't a coincidence. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about my land. No, this was about control. So, I did what any desperate person would do in my situation. I reached out to people who had been through similar situations. I found online forums, Facebook groups, and Reddit threads filled with people who had fought back against corrupt HOAs. One person's story stood out to me. It was a woman who had dealt with an HOA that tried to take away her backyard, claiming it was too unkept. They fined her repeatedly for small things, then pushed her out by making her feel like the whole neighborhood was against her. But she didn't give up. She found a way to fight back, legally and publicly. She used their own rules against them, and eventually she won. The HOA had to back off. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't let Janet and the HOA think they could walk all over me, not when I had the means to fight back. But here's the thing. I was in a foreign country. I didn't have the luxury of showing up at their office or attending a board meeting. My options were limited. But one thing was for sure. I wasn't going down without a fight. That's when it hit me. If the HOA was going to play dirty, I had to play smarter. I needed a way to hit them where it hurt. And that's when I remembered the one thing the HOA cared about more than anything: money. If I could find a way to make them pay, to make them feel the consequences of their actions, maybe, just maybe, they would start to rethink their plans. But how? How could I take back control when I was thousands of miles away, when they held all the power, when they had already stolen my land from me? What would you do in my place? Would you fight back, or would you give up and walk away from everything? I wasn't the type to back down. I had never been the guy to let someone walk all over me, especially when it came to something as important as my land. But here I was, stuck in a foreign country, a world away from my property, with the HOA making decisions about my life without even telling me. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't just going to let them get away with it. They had crossed a line. They'd taken my land and tried to turn me into a nobody. Someone who couldn't even fight for what was rightfully mine. I knew I had to act fast. They were already starting to treat me like I didn't matter. So, what could I do from so far away? What could one man do when an entire HOA board was working against him? I remembered the forums I had been reading, the stories of people who had taken on HOAs and actually won. Some used legal action, others used public exposure, and then there were those who took it to the streets and let the community know what was going on. But I didn't have that luxury. I was stuck in another country, and no one even knew I was fighting this war. But what I did have was information. I went back to the HOA documents, the ones that were buried deep in the pile of papers I had received when I first bought the land. At first, they seemed so insignificant. Just a bunch of boring legal stuff about rules and fines, but now they were my only weapon. The more I looked, the more I realized that they had violated their own rules. Janet, the HOA president, had made it sound like they were above reproach, that they had every right to sell my property. But after some careful reading, I found it, a loophole. The HOA was required to give proper notice before selling a piece of property, and it had to be done through public auction. But there had been no public auction, no notification, and most importantly, no explanation. This wasn't just a case of an HOA making a bad decision. This was a case of fraud. I could feel my blood pressure rise. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my land anymore. This was about standing up to a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long, and I wasn't going to be the one to let it slide. I knew I couldn't just jump on a plane and storm their office. I needed a strategy. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I could expose them for what they were doing, I could turn the whole community against them. No one would want to live in a neighborhood where they could lose their land at the whim of some petty board members. But how could I make this happen? How could I expose their corruption without them knowing what I was up to? That's when I made the call. I had a friend, a contact from back home, who knew a thing or two about public relations. I'd worked with him in the past on some small projects, and I knew he had a reputation for getting attention when it was needed most. His name was Dave. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how to get people talking. I sent him a message explaining what had happened and asking for his help. The response I got back was almost immediate. "I can get you in touch with some people. You don't need to be here to make this a big deal. We'll get the word out, but you need to make sure this is bulletproof. We need all the facts, and we need them now." That was all I needed to hear. For the next few days, I gathered everything I could. I took screenshots of the HOA's website, showing the changes they had made to my property status. I gathered all the legal papers I had, including the official notices from the HOA, and I made sure to get copies of the bylaws. If I was going to expose them, I needed everything to be airtight. There could be no room for doubt. Meanwhile, I kept up the charade. I continued to act like I didn't know what was going on. I kept emailing Janet and the board, asking for more information, pretending like I was just a concerned property owner. But deep down, I knew they were hiding something. Then came the breakthrough. Dave called me one night. "Okay, I've got something for you," he said, his voice low but excited. "I know a reporter from the local news, someone who's interested in stories like yours. If we can get the right angle, we can make this thing explode." I could feel a rush of adrenaline. This was the break I had been waiting for. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Dead serious," he replied. "But you have to be ready. Once we go public, there's no turning back. The HOA is going to come at you with everything they've got." I didn't care. I had already made up my mind. This was my fight, and I wasn't backing down. The next few days were a whirlwind. I spoke to the reporter Dave had put me in touch with. She was smart, sharp, and had covered a lot of controversial stories in the past. She understood the importance of this story. We agreed on the plan. We would expose the HOA's corrupt actions, and we would make sure the whole community knew what they were really up to. But as the days passed and the pressure built, something started to weigh on me. This wasn't just about my land anymore. This was bigger than me. This was about the community I had been part of for so long, and whether or not it was worth saving. Could I really take down the HOA? Could I expose the corruption that ran so deep? And more importantly, was I ready for the fallout? What if the community turned against me? What if I became the villain in my own story? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you expose the truth, no matter the consequences? Or would you try to fight the HOA from within and risk losing everything? The moment I decided to go public, I knew there would be no turning back. It was like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Once I reached out to the reporter, there was no way to go back to the quiet, peaceful life I had before. The HOA had already made it clear they were willing to do anything to take my land from me. Now it was my turn to fight back, and I wasn't going to hold anything back. I spent the next few days gathering all the information I could. I sent the reporter everything: the emails, the official letters, the documents with the loophole I had uncovered, and the screen captures of the HOA website showing the unauthorized sale of my land. I wanted to make sure there were no gaps in the story. I couldn't afford to miss a single detail. I had told myself it was just about the land, that it was about doing what was right. But as the days went by, I started realizing something deeper. This was about justice. It was about the little guy standing up to the people who thought they could do whatever they wanted. It wasn't just about my property. It was about all the other homeowners who felt powerless against the HOA. The next thing I knew, the reporter had written the story. It was bold, it was eye-opening, and it was about to hit the news cycle like a storm. She had gotten all the details right, every email, every loophole, everything that had happened since the HOA first sold my land. She even got an anonymous source within the HOA to confirm that the sale wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate act to get rid of property that wasn't generating enough revenue for them. The article went live, and I held my breath. It felt like I had done something irreversible. I knew the HOA would see it. I knew Janet would see it. The entire neighborhood would see it. But would they back me? Or would they turn on me, siding with the HOA because that's what they had always done? It didn't take long for the backlash to start. The HOA's phone lines lit up. People were calling to demand answers, but Janet and the rest of the board kept quiet. They didn't want to make a move until they figured out how to spin it. I could hear the tension in their silence. That's when the first letter came. It wasn't a notice of legal action or anything like that. It was much worse, an attempt to intimidate me. The letter was carefully worded, like they'd spent hours crafting it. They accused me of spreading false information and warned that I was damaging the reputation of the HOA and the entire neighborhood. But they didn't stop there. No, they included something much darker. Failure to cease your actions will result in further legal consequences. They were trying to threaten me into submission. At that moment, I realized just how deep this went. The HOA wasn't just trying to control my property. They wanted to control everything. They had made people afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge their power, and now they were trying to use their legal muscle to shut me down. But it wasn't just the HOA I had to worry about now. It was the neighbors, too. Some of them had started to turn against me, people I thought I could trust, people I'd waved to when I mowed my lawn or took out the trash. Now they were backing away. They didn't want to get involved. They were scared of the HOA's power. They were scared of what could happen if they took my side. There were a few brave souls who sent me private messages, offering support, but they were the minority. Most of the neighborhood was silent. I wasn't about to let them intimidate me. Not now. Not after everything I had fought for. So, I pushed forward. I reached out to more reporters. I started getting messages from people who had heard about the story, some who had their own HOA nightmares to share. They wanted to know how I was fighting back, and more importantly, they wanted to know what they could do to help. But the HOA wasn't giving up either. They started sending out their own letters to the community, trying to discredit me. They painted me as a troublemaker, as someone who didn't understand the rules of the neighborhood. They made it sound like I was the one causing all the chaos, not them. And that's when I knew. This was about more than just one man versus the HOA. This was about the kind of community we were going to be. Were we going to let a few people with power control us all? Or were we going to stand up and say enough was enough? Then came the twist. Late one night, as I was getting ready to send a follow-up email to the reporter, I got a message. It was from a private email address I didn't recognize. I know you're trying to fight the HOA, but they aren't just doing this to you. I have the proof that this goes much deeper. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. Don't tell anyone. It's bigger than you think. I had no idea who this person was, but my heart raced. I couldn't ignore it. Was this a setup? Or was this someone trying to help? I was on the verge of uncovering something much bigger than I had ever imagined, something that could expose the HOA for everything they had done, not just to me, but to everyone. But should I meet with this anonymous tipster? Was it a trap, or would it be the break I needed to truly take them down? What would you do in my situation? Would you take the risk and meet with a stranger, hoping they could help you expose the truth? Or would you play it safe and stick to your current plan? The message came like a bolt of lightning, and I couldn't ignore it. I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen above the keyboard. Who was this person? How did they know so much? And more importantly, how could they have known what I was doing to expose the HOA? But despite the uncertainty, something inside me told me I had to meet them. This wasn't just another random email from someone looking to cause trouble. The way it was worded, the sense of urgency, it felt different. Like someone who was too scared to come forward in the open, but knew something so big that they couldn't stay quiet anymore. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and left the apartment I had been staying in. There was no point in dragging this out. If someone had the evidence to finally take the HOA down, I had to be there. The meeting point was a small cafe tucked away on a side street, away from the usual hustle and bustle. A place I had never been before. I parked my car and walked in, keeping an eye on the clock. 2 p.m. on the dot. I sat at a corner table, trying to act natural, pretending like I wasn't on edge. The place was quiet. Almost too quiet. I watched the door, my heart thudding in my chest. Was this a setup? Was I walking into a trap? Minutes ticked by, and I began to second-guess myself. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should just leave. But then the door opened. A man walked in, tall, with a hooded jacket pulled up to conceal his face. He scanned the room briefly, then his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't smile or nod, just walked straight toward me and took a seat across from me without saying a word. I couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. It was almost suffocating. The man's eyes were hard, but there was something in them. Something that made me believe he wasn't there to cause trouble. He wasn't one of the HOA's goons. He was someone who had a story to tell, and it was a story I needed to hear. "I know you're not here to waste my time," he said, his voice low. "So I'll cut straight to the point. The HOA you're fighting, it's only the tip of the iceberg." I leaned in, my ears burning. "What do you mean?" I wanted to ask, but I stayed quiet. I had to hear him out. The HOA has been doing this for years. They've been taking people's properties, using legal loopholes, bullying people into silence, he said. But that's just one piece of their operation. They've been making money off this for so long, they don't care who they hurt. You're not the first person they've done this to, and you won't be the last. I was taken aback. I thought I had uncovered everything, their plan, their corruption, but now this man was telling me something much darker. I had been chasing the wrong thread. "Who are you?" I finally asked, unable to keep the question in. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked around the room before speaking again. "I'm not someone you'll find in the HOA's records. I've been investigating them for a while now, undercover. The things they're doing, it's illegal, it's corrupt, but they're protected. The people who run this town, who sit on the HOA board, are in bed with some pretty powerful people." I could feel my blood run cold. Powerful people? I leaned forward, my mind racing. Was this some sort of conspiracy? What kind of people was I up against? He continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They've got connections in local government. They've got lawyers on retainer who will do anything to protect their interests. The moment you push back, they'll come after you with everything they've got. And they'll win. Not because they're right, but because they know how to play the game. My mind was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about the HOA, their power, their control, was nothing compared to what I was hearing now. I had assumed that I could beat them with enough legal firepower and public exposure, but now it seemed like I was facing something far more dangerous. So, what am I supposed to do? I asked. You want me to just give up? The man shook his head. No, I'm not saying give up. I'm saying you need to play smarter. You need to stop thinking small. They've been using you, using all of you, for years. But if you really want to take them down, you have to go after the people behind them, the ones pulling the strings. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. This wasn't just about the land. It was about everything the HOA had been hiding. There was a system in place that was built on corruption and manipulation, and I was only scratching the surface. What do you mean by go after them? I asked, my voice shaking with the weight of the conversation. I mean, the man said, leaning in closer, you need to expose everything, not just what they did to you, but the people they're working with. The politicians, the lawyers, the people in power who are letting them get away with it. If you want to win, you need to bring them all into the light. I sat back, stunned. This wasn't just about taking on a small group of homeowners and a few corrupt officials. This was bigger than I could have ever imagined. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. I had been focused on the wrong fight. The HOA was just a cog in a much bigger machine. The man stood up to leave, but before he walked out, he dropped one last piece of information on me. If you want to take them down, you need to move fast. They've already started making their next move, and if you don't act soon, they'll be untouchable. With that, he was gone. The door shut behind him, and I was left sitting there, trying to process everything he had just told me. Now, I had a decision to make. Could I really go after the HOA's backers? Could I expose the people behind all of this, those who were too powerful to touch? Or shall I? Would I just let it go and let the people in charge continue their reign of terror? What would you do in my situation? Would you fight against the hidden powers that control everything? Or would you stick to your original plan, risking it all for what's right? I sat in my car, staring at the street ahead, trying to process everything that had just happened. The meeting with the mysterious man felt like a turning point, one I couldn't ignore. He had given me more than just information. He'd given me a new direction. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made myself a target. I had been fighting against the HOA, thinking I was fighting for my property, for justice. But now I realized I wasn't just taking on the board. I was up against a system that was protected by powerful people with resources that I couldn't even imagine. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for something much bigger, the truth. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew what I had to do. I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. I had uncovered enough to know that this wasn't just about some petty disputes over lawn care or mailbox heights. This was about people who had been systematically taking what wasn't theirs, using their influence, their power to control everything and everyone in their way. But I couldn't do it alone. I had already reached out to the reporter, but now I needed to go even further. It wasn't enough to expose the HOA. I needed to get to the people behind it, the ones who were funding their operations, the ones who had made sure that no matter what happened, the HOA would remain untouchable. I had learned one thing from my research and the conversation with that anonymous source. The HOA wasn't just a group of neighborhood busybodies. They were connected to the elite, the ones who had the real power in the town, the politicians, the developers, the wealthy families who needed to maintain control over the community. I needed to expose them all, and I wasn't going to stop until I did. The next few days were a blur. I spent every waking hour researching, talking to sources, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I dug into the HOA's financial records, their board meeting minutes, anything that could tie them to the people who were really pulling the strings. I found something. A connection that tied Janet, the HOA president, to a local developer who had been buying up properties in the neighborhood for years. The same developer who had been making a fortune by pushing out homeowners who couldn't afford to keep up with the ever-growing list of rules and fines the HOA was enforcing. It all clicked. This was no longer about the HOA selling my land. This was about a plan to gentrify the entire neighborhood, to push people out and make way for new, wealthier residents. I had the evidence. I had the names. Now I just needed to bring it all together. I reached out to the reporter again. She was just as determined as I was, and together we came up with a plan. We would release the story, everything. We would expose the corrupt connections between the HOA and the developers, the politicians who had been paid off, and the lengths they had gone to in order to manipulate the community. The moment we hit publish, I knew everything would change, but I didn't realize just how much. When the story went live, it was like a bomb had gone off. The reactions were immediate and overwhelming. People who had been silent for so long started speaking up. Neighbors who had been too afraid to challenge the HOA began reaching out, sharing their own stories of intimidation, fines, and bullying. It wasn't just my fight anymore. This was the whole neighborhood rising up. And then the HOA reacted. At first it was a few passive-aggressive emails, trying to discredit the story, claiming it was all lies. But then they started going after me directly, legal threats, more letters, calls to my family. They were trying to intimidate me, trying to silence me. But I didn't back down. Instead, I pushed harder. I went public with everything I had. I reached out to news outlets, shared the evidence, and kept pushing until the story couldn't be ignored. The pressure started to mount on Janet and the rest of the board. The developer they were connected to, the one behind all of this, he was starting to get nervous. His name was popping up in the news. He was being linked to shady deals and backdoor deals with the HOA. His reputation was on the line. And that's when things really started to heat up. I remember the day the developer's company issued a public statement denying any wrongdoing. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The public had already turned against them. The local government couldn't ignore the pressure anymore. They had no choice but to launch an investigation into the HOA's dealings. That's when I knew we had won. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about exposing the system that had been taking advantage of people for far too long. It was about showing the neighborhood that there was a way to fight back, that no one was too small to make a difference. But even as I sat back and watched the story unfold, something still nagged at me. The fight wasn't over yet. There were still people in power who would try to make this all go away. The investigation was just the beginning, but it was a start. Now, I had to ask myself, had I done enough? Was the exposure of the HOA just the first step in a larger fight? And more importantly, was I ready for the fallout? Would you keep pushing, knowing that the people you're up against won't go down without a fight? Or would you step back, hoping the system would fix itself? I had spent weeks battling the HOA, weeks fighting for my land, for justice, and for the truth. The media had caught wind of it, and the story was spreading faster than I ever imagined. People from all over the neighborhood had started to speak up, sharing their own frustrations with the HOA, and soon the whole community began to turn against the very people who had held them hostage for years. But with every victory, there was a price. The more I exposed, the more the HOA and the developers pushed back. Threats came from every angle: legal threats, intimidation, even warnings from people who said, "You don't know what you're messing with." But none of that fazed me, not anymore. I had seen firsthand what they were capable of, and I wasn't going to stop until the whole town knew the truth. I remember the day the investigation was finally launched. It wasn't a huge announcement or anything dramatic. It was just a quiet email, a few words confirming what I had known all along. The authorities were getting involved. That was the turning point. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about my land being sold. It wasn't just about the HOA's greed and corruption. It was about a whole community finally waking up. Neighbors who had been silent for years, who had been afraid to speak up, were now standing tall. They were calling the HOA out. They were sharing their own stories of how the HOA had hurt them, whether it was through fines, arbitrary rules, or just general harassment. The pressure mounted on Janet and the board. They had no choice but to react. They tried to fight back with more legal threats, but it was too late. The walls were closing in on them. Their connections to the developer were exposed, and the investigation was making waves. People were starting to realize that the HOA had been running a racket, using their influence to line their pockets while the rest of us paid the price. It didn't take long before the HOA board was forced to resign. Janet was the first to go. She was caught in the crossfire, and her reputation was in tatters. The developers, too, were under investigation. The story had gone viral, and the public was demanding answers. But here's where things took a surprising turn. Just when I thought the fight was over, I got a call. It was from one of the reporters who had been covering the story. "Are you sitting down?" she asked, her voice serious. "We've just uncovered something big, something that could change everything." My heart raced. What could possibly be bigger than what had already been exposed? "It turns out," she continued, "the HOA was just the tip of the iceberg. We've connected them to a whole network of corrupt officials in the local government. There are backdoor deals, money laundering, and more. This goes much deeper than we thought." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. What had started as a simple fight for my land had now turned into a massive public scandal. This wasn't just about a corrupt HOA anymore. It was about exposing an entire system that had been built on manipulation and deceit. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe easy. I had taken down the HOA, I had exposed them for what they really were, and I had helped shine a light on the bigger issues that had been hiding in the shadows for so long. But as the weeks went by, and the story continued to unfold, I realized that this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. The fallout from everything that had happened was still unfolding. The investigation was still ongoing, and there were still people who had yet to be held accountable. I thought back to the people who had supported me throughout this journey, those who had stood by me, who had shared their own stories, and who had helped bring this fight to the forefront. They were the real heroes. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the kind of world I wanted to live in? Was this the kind of community I wanted to build? The HOA had taken my land, but I had taken back my power. And in the process, I had uncovered a system of corruption that was much larger than I had ever imagined. But it wasn't just about exposing the bad guys. It was about reclaiming what was mine and making sure that no one else had to suffer the way I had. As I sat back and watched the news, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The twists, the turns, the moments when I thought I'd lose everything. But in the end, I had won. Or had I? There was still so much left to do. There were still so many questions left unanswered. I had fought for justice, but now it was time to fight for something else, something bigger. And that's when the real question hit me. How much was I willing to sacrifice to make sure this never happened again? I had taken on the HOA, and I had won. But what did that mean for the future of my neighborhood? What did it mean for the people who had supported me? And most importantly, what did it mean for the community that had been broken by years of abuse and control? Would I continue fighting, knowing that there were more battles ahead? Or was it time to walk away and let others take the lead? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you keep pushing, knowing that the fight isn't over? Or would you move on, satisfied with what you had already accomplished?